Our agenda item for our study session is the Veterans Tiny Homes Project, and I'll turn it over to our city manager, Jeff Knighton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, members of council, and members of the public. Tonight, I wanted to discuss the draft lease agreement that the council has in front of them. This has been an item of discussion with the council and the community for quite some time, and I think we're getting close to a point where this issue can be resolved. A few of the provisions in the lease agreement that I wanted to go over is we had presented a proposal to Ponza and to Quixote Communities for a $10,000 per year lease for a 30-year term. And after some discussion with the representatives for Quixote Communities, they have countered and offered a $5,000 a year lease for 29 years. So the lease payments would start in the second year of the term and continue through year 30. That would be a total in the lease in section 2. You'll see an item $10,000 per year for a $300,000 total, and those numbers would be changed under the counter proposal to $5,000 per year and $145,000 total. A couple of the other things that I wanted to mention in the agreement before turning over to council for discussion and questions. There is a provision in section 10 that would require veterans reside in the community, and there is also has been some discussion about limiting the total to 30 homes total. The provision as it's written now would allow further modification, but a notification to the city for any prior to commencing modifications on the property. So that's something for the council can discuss. In section 8 about the equivalent residential unit calculation, we do have a calculation in there that would require, or that would charge for the sewer and water hookups and all those types of services at 25% of the typical single-family home. So each 4 units would pay one full residential equivalent unit. The last item I wanted to mention, in the agreement you have, and we have a reformatted version that we can send to you, but in section 10, this is on page 4, the management and use of premises. The last line had such management plan shall include at a minimum the following provisions, and then it has a colon there. That was simply a formatting issue. Sections 11 and 12 should be sub paragraphs to that initial section. So again, we have a reformatted version that we will present to you at the public hearing when you consider this item. All the other provisions, we don't see any changes, any other changes or typos that we may have had, and I'd be happy to turn it over to council to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Jeff. Questions for Jeff or further discussion?
Anybody want to add anything?
So,
Additions or deletions, or just questions about specific provisions, timing, any of that, I'd be happy to answer.
so you mentioned, I'll ask a question. Currently, the lease would allow, subject to notification of the city, you could read it as additional units being added.
I believe that you could. It's a little ambiguous at the moment, but we have developed some language that we could add in that would limit this project to 30 tiny homes total.
So I guess that'd be a question for council, is our discussion based on proposed 30 units or potentially additional units?
I think it would be negotiable. They wanted to add more down the road.
And the provision as it's written today would permit that.
Yes. We could add language that they would have to come back to the council for that significant modification or something equivalent to that?
Yes, we could.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we would just need to, and if I could just jump in here, the improvements and modifications kind of covers obviously like a broad category of things. So let's say they wanted to add, I don't know, like new sidewalks or something. That would potentially be an improvement or modification. So If that's not the type of thing that we care about, then maybe that's not the type of thing that we would require them to come to the council on. But something specific, like if we wanted to limit it to 30 units, then we would make the language specific to capping that amount, and they would have to come to the council for approval. In other words, I'm not explaining this very well, but so this provision has gone through a few revisions now over the last 4 or 5 drafts of the lease. Originally, it was drafted that basically any modification, they would have to get consent from the council. That imposes a bit of a burden on them, because like I said, if they want to make some sort of small modification that we might not really care about, they shouldn't necessarily have to come to the council for everything that they do. But if there's something specific that we want to limit, we basically just want to figure out what that is and say that, okay, you can just provide notice for these modifications, but the bigger things that we care about, these are the things that you need to come to the council for approval on. And so if the number of units is important, then we'll make sure to put that in. And then if there's anything else, we can add that as well.
So what would be a modification that we would be concerned about and that we would not be concerned about?
That's exactly what the study session is for you to consider. I mean, so far what I've heard is we want to basically put in a provision saying, you know, after the initial construction of 30 units, if lessee wants to add any additional units, they'll have to get council approval. So then if there are other modifications that we want to put some sort of council approval requirement on, that's something that we would have to figure out.
I think that's fine. I think they, if they want to add 10 or 20 more, it should come back to the council, and we can fill in how it's been going the first 30, and see how it's been going. So.
Yeah, and it's understandable that other sorts of minor modifications are probably not of the nature that we would want to actually require council approval. But again, that's up to us.
Yeah, if they want to put in a bike rack or something, you don't really need to.
Yeah, and obviously it goes without saying that any sort of modifications they would do would be subject to sort of the normal permitting process and stuff anyway.
So is that consensus of council that we would want that limitation in the lease?
Yes.
Seeing nods, okay,
Okay, so anything over 30, they would need to return to council.
yes, any resident number over 30, right. Okay, everybody good with that? Okay.
Yep.
Any other questions, comments, additions?
I would just say, I think the fee, the reduction of the fee in here to 25% of the cost of a single-family residence per unit, because you're looking at a studio apartment, that I think that is realistic and a fair, and I think that's a good thing to have in there.
And just just so council is aware, that's something that will require a code change in our code, and we will bring that back to council prior to the start of construction, if and when that occurs.
Follow-up question on that. Will that set precedents for other people building, if not similar, at least a lower size house? To come back and say, we're only half instead of a full?
I think it could, but those are usually very specific discussion items with council for these types of projects. Any other type of project, whether it's a 30-unit apartment complex with several studio units or something like that, wouldn't necessarily apply in this case. These don't have shower facilities, for instance. So there's very concrete criteria that we can point to as the reason why we're offering a reduction for those services. Other types of residential units will have all those amenities included inside that self-contained unit, where these don't.
Excuse me, Jeff, I believe these are proposed to have not only a toilet, but also a shower unit
Okay.
in these facilities.
Would this be considered like a planned unit development? Is that what this would be, kind of, so?
Under land use, it would be a planned unit development, as that would be applied.
And the process for this, we have the work session tonight. We'll add the provisions or delete the provisions that the council wishes to see. We will then schedule a public hearing, so the public has an opportunity to comment on those lease provisions. There will be a second reading of the ordinance before council again. And then during the PUD process, PUDs are subject to hearings examiner hearings as well. So this will be, there'll be a total, well, at least 3 public hearings and public forums on this topic.
Okay. Joe?
Question on revenue. Is there any opportunities to distribute the revenue outside of the water fund?
I don't believe so, because this is waterfront property. It would need to be dedicated to that fund, so that we couldn't use it for other purposes other than those associated with water infrastructure and development.
Okay.
We can verify that, though, and make sure we have that 100% sure about the answer at the public hearing.
Thanks.
And I've had some discussion, I think, with some council members about further prioritizing the eligibility counties. Is everybody fine with Mason County first, and then after that, no priority? Okay.
Could you, one more thing, could you explain that, the 12% per annum, down there, just, it's in number 13, about premises, corrections. Could you explain a little bit about that?
12% per annum.
That late payment.
Oh, maintenance.
Yeah, maintenance, 13 maintenance, about halfway, to 3/4 of the way down.
Okay, so it's, if we have to do the work.
In the event the lessee fails.
So this provision basically requires the lessee to perform maintenance on the premises. And that provision essentially says that if they don't, then the city's entitled to enter the premises to perform that maintenance. And then we can basically charge them interest
Okay,
on whatever they owe us for whatever maintenance that we have to do.
all right.
I don't expect this provision to come into play, but
No, I wanted to.
it is nevertheless there.
Clear.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Maintenance. Mowing grass, shoveling snow, maintenance, or utility maintenance,
Painting.
physical
repairing,
structural
yeah.
maintenance. Do we need to be more specific on that? Because
I
especially
mean,
after this
the-
last week.
I mean, the
So,
the whole section 13 describes the type of maintenance that they're required to do.
okay.
So if we maintain, or if we're requiring the premises be maintained and repaired in clean and sanitary condition, and pay for any maintenance, janitorial, or landscape services, so that the mowing grass and the
Okay.
shoveling snow would be covered.
Yeah, it's a pretty broad definition,
Yep.
and it does, and that provision does require that we provide them notice first, obviously, so.
Sure.
We're not just gonna,
Show up
and
and
show up
start mowing
and
grass.
start mowing grass and then charge
Okay.
them. We would let them know, like, and I doubt we would let them know about something like mowing, although maybe we would, I don't know. If the grass really gets out of control, we might, but, yeah.
Just wanted to make sure.
And then question on the access that came up at our meeting at Christmas Village. And then lighting on the walkway, that will be addressed later on in the process
During the development process, during the PUD, planning unit development discussions, application, and then eventual hearing with the hearings examiner, the access can be discussed and designed then, as well as the lighting requirements on the pathway and interior of the site have to be in compliance with our engineering standards. And I believe Craig has a little bit of information on the lighting requirements now, if you'd like to go a little bit more in depth with that.
Might just summarize it, Craig, if you can.
There are illumination on the street
portion. And within our standard, I'm not sure there's really a mechanism to require any additional lighting in that area on 13th Street. Especially, well, if the entrance is somewhere in the Christmas Village type area across from their entrance, there are a couple of illumination poles there. And our standards do refer to WSDOT standards. And within WSDOT standards, it basically references curves in the road, increased crime in the evening, increased crashes in the evening, hidden driveways. But if it were to go across from Christmas Village, as far as the entrance goes, you've got illumination poles on both sides of what would be the proposed driveway, at least from the sketches we've seen. So I don't know that there would really be a mechanism to require any additional lighting or lighting of the pedestrian path.
But if the driveway is moved, as was a discussion at Christmas Village, then there would be an opportunity there.
And there is no illumination on Wallace Nealon between Shelton Springs Road and 13th at all. We've been in discussions with PUD about adding some infrastructure there. We tried to get a cost from them of what that would look like with the savings that we're having from the Downtown Connector project and purchasing our own illumination poles. We've started that discussion of what that looks like and could we get a net zero and add some illumination along Wallace Nealon, but we have not heard back from them. We should shortly. So we'll have a little better idea of what that will look like. But yeah, obviously if we change the entrance to Wallace Nealon, something is we're gonna need some sort of illumination at least for the driveway section.
Okay, so what I heard is there may be illumination requirements on the roadway, but probably no requirements on the walking paths. Is that a correct statement?
Correct. There are illumination warrants, much like you would warrant a traffic signal. We looked at them fairly extensively today and couldn't find an illumination warrant that we could really point to that would require additional illumination on the 13th Street section.
So if council feels that's an important step, it'd have to be part of the lease. Is that
Well,
fair statement or not?
there's a couple of different ways to approach that. One would be as part of the lease agreement. The second would be as part of a overall code change prior to the vesting of the planned unit development application. Once a application is vested, they're locked into the requirements that are in place at that time. However, if we had code changes in place prior to the vesting of the application, then we could require those types of illumination and other standards that may or may not exist today in regard to the PUD.
And that's also something that we looked at today and talked about today, was that bringing that back to the council. Right now, any sort of development, it is very difficult to require illumination, which we feel at the staff level that it's a fairly important component of building a really good project, no matter what it is, whether it's tiny homes or a 100-unit housing development, that illumination is likely something that we would like to see. So that was a discussion that we did have today, as far as bringing it back to the council as making that a requirement for development.
Could those two illuminating poles now have one added on the back side of it? Or,
You could retrofit any of those. They're concrete poles. We've done it in the past where we've had an insert. Basically, it's a roto hammer into the illumination pole with an insert to screw into, and we have retrofitted those in the past. So certainly, any of those poles along 13th Street could be retrofitted with a drop, much like we've got on the ones at Downtown Connector project, where we've got a pole or an illumination arm coming off of the backside for the pathway, certainly.
Craig, at one point, I thought you made the comment that would be almost less cost effective than putting a new string of poles. Is that, my memory failing me, or?
We had a discussion at one time of if we were going to have illumination poles on Wallace Nealon, that it would likely be cheaper to just move the existing poles that we have, order poles that could have the dual arms on them. So I don't know if you weren't gonna utilize those poles in an alternate location, it would probably still be more cost-effective to retrofit them than it would be to purchase new poles. But if we were gonna add lighting in a certain area, I think it would be much better to take those poles, move them, if you weren't gonna require some sort of illumination on that walkway or that pathway, because that, you know, even on the Wallace Nealon section between Spring Road and 13th has a walking path. So whether we'd like to light that walking path up, and it's not saying that that walking path doesn't get some light onto it. Those LEDs are fairly decent downcast, but you do get some illumination off of those street lights also, so.
Thanks for clarifying, thank you.
You're welcome.
So wouldn't this be an item that would be addressed in like the site plan review process? I mean, you haven't gone through a full-blown site plan review process with them yet. You've talked in generalities, but isn't that something like, hey, we really think there should be this? Is that not something, rather than a lease, things that would come up during the site plan review process? It did in my
Potentially,
world.
yeah.
Y'all did that in my world.
Certainly, it could be something that community development addresses through that site plan review.
That's how it usually happens with a small developer when he's doing a project. You guys have some ideas, you know. Suggestions.
With direction from the council, we can certainly bring that to the table.
Is that,
Yeah, so the way I picture this is we can start working on some code modifications as necessary, not only for this project, but code modifications for developments citywide that would apply everywhere. And there's several ideas that I can talk with council about that would meet your ideas of what the city would look like in the future. And we can bring those to you and then have those codified and adopted by the council prior to the vesting of the tiny homes applications and other applications that are coming in the door.
Okay. Just for my curiosity, do we have consensus on the council that would be an important requirement or not? Additional lighting on the pathway?
I think it's important.
I don't know what the project is already, I mean, when they come back with their architectural plans, I mean, they may have big lights on the back of the, I mean, I
Yeah,
don't know
right.
what it
Good.
is.
Right.
So, I mean, remember, it's to their advantage to have paths lit.
Close, close.
Lit properly. It's to their advantage to have for insurance purposes and all kinds of stuff, you know, so I mean, and that's not a very big thing to do. I mean, it's kind of inside the property. I don't know on outside, you know, like you're talking about for street, but if you were talking about any lights inside the compound, you know, I would imagine they would want proper lighting too. So I imagine their architect would have sufficient exterior lights, I would think, you know.
I mean, you talking about lighting up a whole block or just the driveway into the building?
I think what I heard was people wanting more light along the pathway for that entire block, or that
We were-
entire, it's probably more than blocks, probably 2 or 3 blocks, isn't it?
So
It
we
is. It's a
require
couple of blocks.
one development to put 3 blocks of lights in? I don't agree with that.
Well, and more than that, I think that building off what Eric said, looking at being equitable project to project, I have some concerns with requiring cumbersome, maybe cumbersome projects specific to this property because we are holding the cards of having the land. And certainly, I think that there's some balance on that, but I don't think that it's reasonable to ask them to do up extraordinarily above and beyond what we would require of any other planned unit development. Being a PUD, of course, there is some give and take to begin with, but I think we have to be thoughtful about how that sits as far as being equitable across projects.
I concur with that statement.
And just so council's aware, typically there are frontage requirements, so directly in front of the subject property, the developer, regardless of who it is, whether it's this project or any other, would be required to make the improvements in our standards in front of their project. If it's something off-site, meaning away from their direct property frontage, there has to be what the Supreme Court called a compelling nexus to require those types of improvements in order to mitigate the impacts of the project. And we can take a look at that.
Okay. Because I believe north of Shelton Springs, the walkway is illuminated with separate lights, correct? I believe it is. I'm not sure, but Councilmember.
I think that with the uneasiness that some of the residents of Christmas Village has, I think that illumination along that area would be, maybe put some fears to rest when there's more lighting along there. So, that's.
Further discussion, I believe. Okay. Anything else? Councilmember Schmidt?
I know there hasn't been an official fee schedule assessed with this yet, but what was the estimated number again? Impact fee wise? Do you remember? Was there one? An estimate?
Including traffic impact fees?
Correct. And if it's a stretch, don't worry about it. It was just, I'm trying to write up some numbers here.
We can certainly get you that information if we don't have it tonight.
Site plan review is 1,500. PUD preliminary 900 plus legal noticing costs. PUD finals 550. SEPA checklist 350. This is from community development side, and then 47 from the address request form. And of course, legal noticing fees would go along with, because we have an obligation to notice through our paper of record for
Sure.
these processes.
And was there a TIF?
Traffic impact fee was estimated to be just over 112,000. Originally, when we
Sure.
talked about 30 units, was just over 112.
Okay,
And then your associated GFCs,
sure.
yeah.
And all of those impact fees would return to the water fund, correct?
The water impact fee would, sewer impact fee would return to the wastewater fund. Traffic would go to the traffic fund.
And, sorry, any of the funds expended, I just want to make this clear, make sure this is a clear understanding in my head. So any of the funds the city needs to expend in preparation and/or finalization of the lease, preparation of the property to be leased, whatever that may be, if that may turn into anything, is that also to be expended from the water fund? Or is that expended from the individual general fund from public works? Like if we had to move material or whatever.
So the water fund would pay for the water infrastructure, and it's the same for each of the funds. Traffic impact fees would pay for traffic infrastructure, at least part of it. The other associated costs would come from our general fund and/or permit fees.
Okay,
So that, can I ask a
yeah,
clarification on that?
yeah, go ahead.
So if we had to move some of those stockpiles up there at city expense, that would be a general fund, that would not be a road fund expense?
Depending on how, what those items are for, and I would imagine they are, what, base layer, or could they be associated with traffic impacts?
All of the departments, whether it be backfill material, ditch backfill, subgrade material for a roadway, any of those materials would be used for any department, whether it be water, sewer, storm,
Okay.
or transportation.
So we would take a percentage of those, and we could charge the costs to each fund, as long as there is a direct impact for what those materials are being used for. And the cost of moving those materials and finding a new location was one of the reasons we were looking at the lease fee to begin with, so that the city is at least made somewhat whole by the lease payment.
Yeah, and if I could follow up, and that was kind of my initial question of the revenues coming back to the water fund and not necessarily making the situation whole again down the road. Yeah, it would be interesting to know if there is a way that we could either specifically move those funds, that revenue, into a specific fund that is to deal with this project, and or just put it in the general fund so we can allocate those out. And I know Terry's nodding her head no, but you see maybe my point in, you know, it's, we end up playing the shell game with the bank accounts, and that's not, yeah.
I think with Director Gregory's help, we can get those percentages as close as possible.
Sure.
And make those, allocate the cost to those funds as appropriate.
And much like Jeff just mentioned, the way we've done it in the past is like the Public Works shop area is owned by the water utility. So any improvements done to that site are paid exclusively by the water fund, but then are recovered through IDC, an indirect cost, that all of the other departments that are utilizing that facility pay the water fund for. So basically, the water fund is the landlord, and then any associated costs to that facility are paid by the individual department. So much like the same thing Jeff is explaining, any of those things that would be, they're basically paying for this laydown yard, they own it, so any improvements would be paid by them, but then recovered through an indirect cost to each associated user.
Simple.
That's Terry's world, super simple.
As long as we're on this topic, can you just summarize what we're gonna do or do nothing with the current stockpiles? If this lease as written, if it went through, what would be the status of the city stockpiles?
So our first option will be to find another location that the city already owns where we can move those materials. If that is not an option, then we will look at opportunities to potentially share the site. But we would need liability protections there for our materials and probably a different construction entrance, because we don't want, or not a construction entrance, but a different entrance for our vehicles and our folks entering the site. So the two aren't intermixed, just to reduce liability as much as possible. Finding another site has proved difficult so far, but I am confident Craig can do that.
But correct me if I'm wrong, last time we discussed this, we discussed the quantity that was there and how much effort it would take to move that. And if we were to buy it outright all over again, it was nearly a wash.
Yep.
So let me ask from an efficiency standpoint, what are we looking at as far as, are we going to move an existing stockpile and pay to move it rather than purchase new material for the same cost that might be a better quality or have less impact on staff time?
So we're looking at opportunities, and we'll be performing a cost-benefit analysis to determine which would be best if we get some donated help from some of our community partners to help move those materials. If not, and it's close to being a wash, Craig and I could talk about the best way to handle that. But whatever decision is made in that regard will be with an eye on making sure that we're doing the best we can with taxpayer dollars.
And on the kind of similar subject, section 16, if the city is going to move the material, the leasee will relocate 5,000 cubic yards. Is that the way I read that? If we decide we need to move some of the material?
It says within the confines of the premises to enhance the city's access.
Okay, so that's just on the premises.
That just means that if we ask them to, they'll move some of it around to make it easier for us to get to.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
John, just a point of clarification, when we're talking the premises, what are we actually talking? Are we talking that entire triangle between Shelton Springs Road, 13th, and Wallace Nealon? Or are we talking about the much smaller site north of the creek? What are we constituting as the premises? And the reason I ask is
Yeah.
we have identified
Right.
that smaller piece on the south side of the creek that abuts Shelton Springs Road as a potential site, but I'm not sure if that's considered part of the premises or not.
Yeah, and I guess that would depend on how, on how we specifically, so the premises is basically specifically defined in the lease. And so we could basically change what the actual definition of the premises is if we want to change it to, whatever makes the most sense.
Is the definition now the smaller piece within the large one?
I think so, yes.
Okay.
But I'm not 100% confident on that.
Because that would certainly affect your frontage improvements also.
Right.
If we expand that, and make that encompass the entire site. So, something just to be aware of.
And that was a good point. The piece of property related to this lease agreement should be the piece of property that's being utilized for the project and not any excess. So does that work with what has been surplus thus far, that particular parcel, or does that need to be actually kind of carved out within that? I don't know how that.
So if we were to limit the premises to just the area that is considered for the project, then the remaining portion of that parcel would still be surplus land, but there is nothing that requires we put it on the market. There's nothing that requires we do anything with it.
Right.
It's just available to be sold, but you don't have to.
It's also I guess, a much larger decision or discussion that needs to happen also if that entrance moves to Wallace Nealon, because then actual limits of property would be, I guess, more difficult to define. You could do it, but if you were cutting across that entire property to get to Wallace Nealon for an entrance, technically they're utilizing that section and the frontage on Wallace Nealon also. So I think that's maybe a point of clarification also if we're talking about moving the entrance.
And that would just be a legal description. We can have a surveyor draw that up.
Anything else? So really, the only modification we made in the lease was adding some limitation on what modifications could be completed.
That's what I've heard from council, and I wanted to confirm that before the study session was over, is that there language added to section 7 to limit the project to a common building, a single common building, and 30 tiny homes. Any future modifications that would add additional residential units and/or common buildings must come back to council for approval. But that other improvements, the couple of examples John mentioned, like adding a piece of walkway or something like that, a bike rack, that would not have to come back to council for approval, but would have to go through the typical permitting process with the city.
Correct.
We're not gonna ask them to come to us to put a storage shed up though, right?
Permitting, yeah.
No,
I'm talking if you go to Lumberman's and buy a shed, you're not gonna require them to come to us for that.
typically, anything under 120 square feet doesn't require, is it 200? Okay. So anything under 200 square feet wouldn't require a permit anyway. So that's not something that we would require to come back to council, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think we would specify like additional residential units or something like that to make it clear.
Yeah.
You mentioned a sidewalk. Did you mention a sidewalk would be an improvement? That would have to be brought back.
Under the language now, but under the proposed language, it would not.
Well, under the language now, it wouldn't. So right now, there's nothing, right now, the lease doesn't require them to come back to the council at all
No.
for any sort of improvement. It just requires that they give notice.
Notification.
So they would basically just say, hey, just FYI, we're gonna, you know, build a statue or whatever. So we're basically gonna add a requirement that they still provide notice for any, for improvements, but then they would have to get council approval for additional, specifically for additional residential units beyond the initial 30. That's at least my understanding from the discussion tonight.
That's correct, I believe. Is everybody good with that? Okay.
So my intentions are to schedule a public hearing for the lease agreement on your March 19th agenda. And then a follow-up on the first April meeting, I'm not sure what the date is at this point, for a second reading.
I'm just gonna take this opportunity to ask Mike, anything you wanna comment on before we get further down the road and then have to come back?
No, I like the conversation. I think that the conversation about the fill material, you know, there's lots of moving parts there, and we're happy to work with the city on whatever they need. There's room to store that material on site and still build a village and not have to shuttle it twice until we decide what we want to do. So I don't know that we need to worry about that.
I think I just need to meet with maybe Craig and figure out what the specific language is for the actual portion of the premises that we're gonna lease. Because I think part of the problem is we surplus this whole big chunk, but they're not using all of it for the project. And so we don't have to lease the whole thing. We can lease a smaller portion of it. We just have to figure out what makes the most sense for the parties, so.
Yeah, we certainly don't need the whole thing, and if the city has an opportunity to sell the stuff south of Shelton Creek, I would encourage them to do that because it's more revenue for the city, so.
On your parcel alone, with the 30 units, and 10 years down the road, you want to add 20 more units, is your parcel going to be big enough for that?
We might build them on top of that pile.
Of you lots, huh? Okay. Anything else on the lease?
Well,
Okay.
I guess,
Go ahead, Councilmember.
just what these two gentlemen were talking about. If a city doesn't have immediate use for some property right next to these 30 units, and if they need, or, you know, are good neighbors, which we believe they are going to be, then I would easily think that we should now make the lease accommodate the possibility of maybe a 20-unit expansion in, so if we, you know, and just because you pile dirt on it doesn't mean that dirt can be moved or whatever later. But I definitely am a little confused about the amount of property. If we're gonna lease them property, I would think it'd be prudent to lease them the amount they need for the clubhouse and the 30, and the possibility of another 20 units. Is that?
So, yeah, it's a good thought, and I appreciate what you're saying. There is sort of a magic recipe that is around 30 to 35 units for the supportive housing model seems to work well when you have a community of that size.
Mm-hmm.
If you try and just add 20 more houses with only 2 staff and 1 community center and so on, it really, I don't know if it's scalable that way. So we may say, let's do 30, let's celebrate the success of that village, and if we like the way it's going, maybe we'll find another location for another one. But I wouldn't just tack 20 more houses.
Okay,
to this.
that's good information. I hadn't heard that before, but makes sense, you know? Huh.
Okay, anything else? Okay, we're gonna adjourn the study session and we'll be back for a regular meeting at 6 o'clock.